So, hi, Tina. Good morning.
Hi, Louise. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being part of the webinar today. This is part one of a two-part series, so to speak, on genealogy basics. So, for those of you who are more experienced, today is a very basic course for those of you who have had questions at your library from patrons but aren't exactly sure how to proceed. For those of you who are experienced as genealogists, maybe personally or through your professional experience, the Part 2 class is going to go into a little bit more detail. That's going to be the same time on October 11th, where we're going to talk about types of resources and where to find them. So while this is more about what you have in your library and just some very basic types of records and simple searches, the one that's coming up in October is going to be more in-depth, and it's going to give you some further avenues of research. For those of you who attended my webinar in February, thank you for coming back. If you did not have the opportunity to sign up for the webinar that I did in February, that was on free internet resources for genealogy, and that is available to listen to through the Rails website, and the handouts from that presentation are also available on the Rails website as well. So feel free to go back and download those handouts as well, because there is an extensive list of genealogy websites that are provided in that lecture, as well as I will give you that same handout again on October 11th. So you'll see that again if you don't have the opportunity to go back and find it. So what we're covering today are very basic genealogy questions, and they are very simple strategies for how to help a patron when they come up to the desk. There's no reason to fear. Genealogists might seem scary, but truly they don't bite, even though sometimes you can equate them with the Walking Dead. Each one of them has a passion and a desire to know where they come from. Sometimes that comes across as a little bit overzealous, and you have to bring them down to reality from time to time, but there's certainly nothing to fear. They're there for instruction from you. They're there for ideas, and sometimes just to bounce ideas off of another human being who might be able to give them some tips and some suggestions. So where do we begin? So genealogy, as you can see, is the investigation of family histories. You know, who exactly is a genealogist? You know, what are they seeking? Where can you find answers? These are all the kinds of things that we're going to talk about today. So there are two types of genealogists that you will typically get that show up at the reference desk or come to you at the library. So you'll have patrons who are visiting your community looking for ancestors from within your town. And a lot of times they're from either out of town or out of state. And then the flip side to that is you'll have patrons from within your community who are looking for their ancestors who live elsewhere. What are they seeking? To be honest, they're seeking everything. They want every little grain of information that they can possibly find on their ancestors. I always joke and say that genealogy is the never-ending pursuit of every last detail of every ancestor you've ever had from now until the time you die. That really hasn't changed. That is still a very true statement. So there is no piece of information that you can provide a genealogist that is going to disappoint them. They're always excited with whatever they can find, either new information or just data that is presenting an ancestor in a different light, or even confirming suspicions that they had already had. So the very first thing that you can do before that person ever walks up to your desk is to assess what you have. What do you already know about the collections that you have within your library? You know, do you have genealogy resources? Do you have things like maps and county histories? Do you have newspapers, whether on microfilm or in print? You know, have they been digitized and available online? Do you have old phone books? City directories are the precursor to the phone books. Back in the day, before every household had a phone, a city directory is what you would use if you were looking for a plumber or the local grade school. So a lot of libraries already have these within their collections. Once you have a good grasp of exactly what it is that you have within your walls, you can create finding aids for the information that you have, and you can highlight important resources and key resources that you offer. Finding aid sounds scary. It's really not. It can be a bookmark with the call numbers to the genealogy books you have. It could be, you know, a postcard-sized, two-sided piece of literature that just describes the databases that you might subscribe to. You know, it can be, there's an example for you in the handout section of just one of the finding aids that I created at my library, which talks about the early history of Plainfield. So it gives the genealogy books we have, it gives the websites that we subscribe to for additional information. It includes the microfilm that we have as well. So, you know, a finding aid is just a way for people to access the collection. It's just a way for people to know what you have. So when that person comes to the desk and asks you, you have something readily available that you can hand over to them, that they can take away with them. If it's something that you can make available on your website, all the better, because then people will already be prepared and have an understanding of what you have before they walk in the door, if they think to look there in advance. Why are we not advancing, Louise? I think I broke the webinar. I apologize, everybody. There we go. There you go. Okay. So we do have I have a poll question for you that Louise is going to send out, and there's just a couple of questions. So the first question is, you know, how many of you already subscribe to a genealogy database like Ancestry or Heritage Quest or Fold3? There's going to be another question that talks about do you link to genealogy websites on your website? And then the last question is, do you have a genealogy collection that you promote within your library as well?
All right, so the first poll is up. Does your library subscribe to Genealogy Database? And I'm going to give it one more second and close it out. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it. Tina, I'm not sure if you can see the results there, but 79% of our attendees said they do subscribe, and 21% said no.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. For those 21% of you who do not subscribe to a genealogy database, the next question is, do you have links to websites available through your webpage? And that would be free resources. That would be things like Family Search or the National Archives, the U.S. National Archives, other free sources of information that are outside of your library.
So people are busy clicking away. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds here. All right. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and show everyone the results. All right, so do you have genealogy links on your website? 65% of our attendees said yes, and 35% said no.
Okay. The last question that I have for you today is, how many of you have a genealogy collection in your library that you promote to patrons?
So I launched the poll. We'll give people a few seconds to vote. 70% of you have voted, 80%. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you, everyone, for participating in those. Let me show you the results. So this says 69% of you have a genealogy collection at your library and 31% do not.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for participating. That gives me a good understanding. It sounds like most of you really do have active participation, either from collections you have within your library or just resources that you're offering to the public. So for those of you who do not have a genealogy collection within your walls, that's not a problem. There are other places where you can provide or instruct your patrons to go for that type of information. So some of the places to keep in mind, you know, is there a historical or genealogical society in your area that you can rely on for information? Some libraries have good partnerships with their local societies. Our library acts as a liaison a lot of times with our society because we're open to the public. many more hours throughout the course of the week. So we'll field questions throughout the week about our local society that we can then in turn turn over to the society on Saturdays when they're open to the public. If you don't have a historical or genealogical society in your area, you know, who else might be collecting genealogical data in your area? The county courthouse is a good example. I'll talk more about that in my webinar on the 11th. But there are other places too. A lot of universities and community colleges have special collections, or they have archives where they're collecting the history of your area as well. So people have a tendency to overlook universities and colleges a lot of times when they're doing genealogy research because they consider them to be more academic and scholarly and less interested in genealogy, and that very well may be the case. But you have to keep in mind also that genealogy and local history go hand in hand a lot of times. Genealogy is the pursuit of individual families and surnames, whereas local history is the research and collection of data on a community as a whole. So while a yearbook would be interesting to a genealogist because it has their grandfather or their great aunt in it, it's important to local historians because it gives you an overview of the community dynamics at the time. So a lot of colleges and universities will collect things that are considered local history, like yearbooks, business directories, maps, and phone books, and things like that because of their connection within the community. So if there's a college and university near you, you might want to contact somebody in their library and ask them, what do you have to help researchers, genealogy researchers, and local history researchers? So if you don't have one of those near you at all as well, does your library participate in interlibrary loan? And that's actually a two-part question. Does your library participate in the fact that they're lending materials and making photocopies and providing genealogy data to other libraries? And are you taking advantage of interlibrary loan as a public library to bring in that data from outside? So are you requesting genealogy books for your patrons from other locations? I keep breaking this, Louise. It doesn't want to advance for me. Sorry about that. I don't know what I'm doing wrong here. Okay. Sorry, folks. It just doesn't like advancing on me. Okay. So for those of you who do have online genealogy databases that you subscribe to, I think Ancestry Library Edition and Heritage Quest are the two most popular databases that are being provided to libraries. Ancestry Library Edition is actually different than Ancestry.com. There's about an 80 to 85% overlap, but there are certain things that libraries do not receive. It's actually owned by a completely different company. Ancestry.com is owned by Ancestry. Ancestry Library Edition is owned by a different company. So the material is not always the same. So what we do not have access to within our library walls are their newspaper collections, and we don't have access to most of their city directories. So things like the Hammond, Indiana newspapers or the Lincoln, Nebraska newspapers are available in the .com. We don't have access to them in the library edition, but we do have access to everything else. We have access to their census records, their military records, their vital records indexes, which for genealogists still provides them with a lot of detail. The .com motto is, if we can allow genealogists to use them from home at 3 a.m. in their pajamas, why would they ever subscribe? So we don't get everything, and that is true for every genealogy database. What Fold 3 provides libraries isn't what they provide the .com users. Genealogy Bank, newspapers.com, what they sell to libraries is not as robust as what you as the individual subscriber get with your yearly subscription. So keep that in mind too, that sometimes it's better to have them do a search on the .com version to see if they're getting the data that they need for wherever they happen to be researching. So other library links that you can connect to that are free, Family Search is a great example. Things like Ellis Island's website is free. The handout from February, if you can find it in the Rails system, is going to give you probably close to 100 different online websites that you can access that you could actually link to through your website. For those of you who are signing up for Part 2 on October 11th, that'll be included in your handout. Or you can email me and I'll send it to you as well so you have it available to you. But what has your library done online to highlight their collections as well? So for the 70% of you who have genealogy collections within your walls, have you done anything to promote that collection in an online world? So have you maybe created an obituary index that you have up online? Have you scanned historic photos? Our library has a lot of our photos up through Flickr just because it's an easy way for people who are doing a Google search or a Bing search for those to ping against our collection and bring them back to the library's website. There are some libraries that digitize their newspapers and the yearbooks in-house, and then they make them accessible online through their website. So there are ways that you can spread the word about what you have within your collections right through your own website. So if you have these collections that are living on a server in your library, consider putting them up on your website and making them accessible to the public. What that does is that's going to prime the pump, as my boss says, that will bring people in and have people contact you, because once they see that you have something, they're going to be interested in what else you have. So, if you think that you're going to put it online and people are going to stop coming in and asking you questions, just the opposite is actually going to be true. They're going to be asking you even more questions once you make that available. So don't be scared. They won't bite. Another resource that you have accessible to you starting just this week on Saturday, on October 1st, is Try It Illinois. So if any of you have never heard of Try It Illinois before, it is actually sponsored by the Illinois State Library, and it's a chance to give libraries and patrons a chance to test drive online databases and electronic resources. So it's not just genealogy. They have all kinds of resources for business and for students and for genealogists and all kinds of databases that are free for us to use from October 1st to November 30th. So some of the genealogy databases that they have Heritage Quest, they have Fold 3, they have Newspaper Archive, they have Historic MapWorks for people who are interested in using historic maps. So there's a lot of different databases that are accessible. All you have to do is go to the web link that's listed above, finditillinois.org/tryit. In the right-hand corner, you'll contact the library. You'll put in your name and your library, and they will send you the password. Once you get that password, you are welcome to share that password with everybody within your community. So if you have a Facebook page, or you have a Pinterest board, or you have some other way that you connect with your public, you can post that link and that password and encourage your patrons to go out there and try it. And if they find a database that they truly love, then you ask them to come back and share their thoughts with you. This is just a way for Illinois libraries to be able to test drive different databases that exist without the hassle of contacting the vendor. Because I know certain vendors out there where if you contact them and ask them for a 30-day trial, they are going to hound you for the rest of their lives and the rest of your life. So this is a way to kind of avoid that pressure to buy and go in and try these databases. So I highly recommend to just go into Try It Illinois and play around once it opens on Saturday to get a feel for the types of collections and the types of resources that exist. For those of you who don't have collections within your walls, there are some great resources that you can use. You've got DPLA, if any of you have heard of Digital Public Library of America. They partnered with WorldCat, and they partnered with, in Illinois, the Illinois Digital Library, the Illinois Digital Archives, sponsored by the Illinois State Library. So now the records that were in Ida, Illinois, are now accessible through DPLA worldwide. Google Books, many of us have probably already used Google Books, but you also have access to free genealogy books through Family Search and through the Hathi Trust. Internet Archive is probably my favorite right now, and the reason being is because this company was started by two hippies from California, and I fully mean hippies. They have the entire bootleg Grateful Dead audio collection in here. There's actually a Grateful Dead archives at Berkeley University, in case any of you are interested in that. But Internet Archives got tired of having to pay third-party vendors for access to historic books, so they started digitizing books that were outside of copyright. So a lot of things that were published between, or before 1923 are accessible to download through Internet Archives at no cost. And the great thing about Internet Archives is the fact that you have access to it in a variety of formats. So you can download things as EPUBs, you can download them to your Kindle, you can download them as PDFs. There's a file format called DAISY. I have absolutely no idea what DAISY is, but it sounds like a lot of fun. But what's great about those of you who don't have genealogy collections in your libraries, what they've done is they've digitized millions of county histories. So if you go out to Internet Archives and you do a search on, Jackson County history, or, Perry County history, Will County history, it's going to bring up probably those county histories that have already been scanned in grayscale or in color. A lot of them were scanned in color, and they are gorgeous. And it takes the burden off of you to try to find those or send them to somebody else to gain access to them. You can just point them right to this website and let them download a copy for themselves. Because they're out of copyright, other than just acknowledging where they found the item, they really don't have to pay. They don't have to really do a lot of copyright. You don't have to be an expert in copyright law in order to use these. So even for those of you who do have collections within your walls, sometimes what I have done is I've downloaded all the copies of the Will County histories, and there are 7 of them that are in Internet Archives, and I've downloaded them and made them accessible to my patrons, so then my books don't have to take the abuse on the copier any longer. They can download a copy for themselves, which are scanned in color, and then I'm preserving my copies for future generations. There are a number of genealogy libraries both within the state of Illinois and within the U.S. that also can provide information for you. We're lucky enough that we have several here. We have the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library here in Springfield, the Newberry Library in Chicago on the north side, the near north side. We have access to things like the Arlington Heights Public Library, Wheaton Public Library, Kankakee Public Library. All are really outstanding genealogy collections. But then you also have the Allen County Public Library in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is one of the best genealogy research libraries in the country, along with Mid-Continent Public Library, which is in Independence, Missouri. So in the Midwest, again, you have Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Libraries. All of these have links on their website to their genealogy collections, but then all of them have connections to other genealogy resources as well. So they're great places to go when you're just not sure exactly what you're looking for, or somebody comes to you and says, I think I had relatives in X location. Sometimes referring back to these libraries can be a great resource for you to connect with people who work with the records and who can give you some tips and some pointers on where to go from here. So now, for those of you who have conducted reference interviews, the idea of conducting a genealogy reference interview can seem darn right daunting. You don't have to run away. You don't have to leave town when that genealogist with their arm full of binders comes walking through the door. But there are very specific things that you want to do to keep them, figuratively, on a very short leash. So the first thing you're going to do anytime somebody walks in the door and you're conducting a reference interview, whether it's a business interview, a genealogy interview, a research paper for grade school interview, is you're going to assess their skill level. So you're going to ask them, how long have you been doing this? What types of things have you been finding? There are usually 3 main questions that you'll get in a genealogy interview. And this is across the board, no matter what type of reference interview you're conducting. And the first one is directional. Where are your genealogy books? The reason why it's such a vague question is because sometimes the person who's coming up to the desk doesn't exactly know what to ask yet. So they want to just see the collection and kind of browse through the collection so they can gather their thoughts and then come back to you with more specifics. Oh, that's great that you have a genealogy collection. I'm really looking for city directories. Do you have those? Or I'm really looking for the history of Kendall County. Do you have that? So sometimes the very first question off the bat is going to be, where is such and such collection? After that, you're going to get a lot of people who have beginning methodology questions. It's going to be things like, I heard that you can help me trace my family tree, or I'm new to genealogy and I'm looking for census records for my grandparents. They're going to be very basic questions on the how-to of conducting genealogy research. The last one is experiential research. Those are the people who are hardcore researchers. They've been doing this for years. You know, they're to the point now where they're looking for very specific pieces of information. I'll laugh and joke and say that these are the people that you want to be the most afraid of, because they're the people more likely to not take no for an answer. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the three main things that you're going to ask, whether it's a directional question, beginning methodology question, or experiential research question is, you know, who are we looking for, where did they live, and what's the time frame? So if somebody walks up to the desk and says, I'm looking for information on my great-grandmother, you're hoping that they can at least tell you what her name is, where she lived, and what time period you're researching. Keep it very simple. And the reason why I say, oh, I thought I fixed that typo. I apologize. Limit your patrons to two main topics, not topics. I apologize for my mistyping. The reason you want to limit them to two main topics is because otherwise they will still be sitting in your office 3 weeks later. So by keeping it simple, limiting them to just two main topics at a time will help get them the research that they need and free up your time to answer follow-up questions. The hardest thing to do when you're conducting a genealogy interview is to keep them on point. They want to tell you their entire family history. And that's not a knock, because sometimes the information can actually be beneficial to you, especially if it's a family who's lived in the area for a really long time and they have very deep roots within your community. Listening to them tell you stories can be useful to you the next time somebody comes in and says, you know, I'm looking for the Carrie Butcher shop that used to be on the corner of 4th and Main. You know, if during the course of your genealogy reference interview, you had a woman in here who was a descendant of that family and told you a lot about it, you know, that can be useful for you going forward. But if you don't set a time limit, you're never going to get anything accomplished, because they will just continue to talk to you about what they're researching, what they're looking for, what they're hoping to accomplish, what they're going to do next Tuesday, and you have to keep genealogists on point and set a time limit. You can always schedule a follow-up interview. You know, if you limit them to 15 minutes, 20 minutes, a half hour, or even an hour, you can set a follow-up interview with them even for later in the day. But you have to keep them to a specific time period. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to help them accomplish what they're looking for. So keep them to two main topics. Are they looking for great-grandma's immigration record and they want to find grandpa's service record? Then focus on those 2 points. When you schedule a follow-up interview, then you can handle the next 2 points of, well, where do I find this and how do I use it? But what you want to do in that initial interview is keep them to the two most important things that they're trying to accomplish that day. And you do that by asking guided questions. So if they're looking for their grandpa's service record, you know, the type of guided questions you would ask would be, what branch of service did they serve? Were they in the Army? Were they in the Navy? What war or engagement did they serve in? Were they in the Korean War? Were they in the Revolutionary War? You know, you want to ask very specific guided questions. Do you have their service number? Do you know their dates of discharge? You want to try to ask questions to keep them on point so that they don't spiral out of control and start talking about things irrelevant to the conversation. So you want to start with, what do you know? So when somebody walks in the door and they say, I'm trying to research my family tree, you know, I heard that the family comes from Germany. Okay, what do you already know? Do you have birth certificates? Do you have ship's manifests? Do you have census information? What type of documentation do you have from within the family? Do you have a family Bible? Did somebody already write a partial family history? Do you have newspaper articles? What do you have that can help you going forward? What types of resources have they already used? Because you don't want to waste your time and their time by recommending records that they've already perused. So when you ask them, what records have you already used? Oh, I've already used Ancestry.com. I've already used Family Search. You know, I've already been to the Newberry Library and looked at the volume set of Germans to America. So then you know that you're going to start recommending resources for them that they have not already looked through. And the most important thing is, what do they want to accomplish? What is the goal of the 2 research questions that they are asking you? Are they hoping to become a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution? Are they looking to find the ancestral town where their family came from? Are they looking to get a copy of Grandpa's service record because they want to acquire the medals that he might have been due at the end of his service? So you always want to ask them, what is their end game? What is their goal? What is it that they're hoping to accomplish? So there are certain documents, there are certain types of records that you're going to use and you're going to recommend to people over and over and over again. And I only gave you 3 today because I need to keep myself and you on time. And as I mentioned to Louise earlier, it's very hard putting a presentation like this together because I give full hour-and-a-half long presentations on each one of these topics. So to boil it down to you in just a slide or 2, it was difficult for me to do. But probably the 3 main things that you are going to direct genealogists towards as you're doing their research, both the beginners and the experts, are you're going to rely on the U.S. Federal Census. So the U.S. Federal Census has been recorded every 10 years since 1790. So 1790, 1800, 1810, they're always done on the zeros. The censuses exist from 1790 up to 1940. That is the most recent census that is accessible to the public online. The census data from 1950 to the present, to 2010, is available through the U.S. Census Bureau's office, but it's not online. So you can contact the Census Bureau and ask them for information, but there's not an index online that you have access to after 1940. The 1890 census was destroyed by fire at the National Archives in the 1920s. So we have 1880, we have 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, but 1890 was largely destroyed. So there's a handful of states in the South with a smattering of counties within where the 1890 census still exists, but for the most part, for us in Illinois, for the Midwest, and for the Northeast, those records were completely destroyed. Now, when census data collection began in the United States, it began in 1790, and they only recorded the heads of households. So George Washington is listed on Mount Vernon, and everybody else gets a hash mark based on their age and their sex. And up until 1860, whether or not they owned slaves, their age and their sex. So you would have, George Washington listed. There'd be a hash mark for him between the ages of, 50 and 60. And then there'd be a hash mark for Martha Washington, listed, her age listed between 50 and 60. And then if there were children or if there were other people living in the household, there would be a hash mark for them as well. The downside is they don't list the members of the household and they don't tell you their relationship to them. It just gives you a hash mark. The first every name census is in 1850, and what an every name census is that everybody in the household is listed. So whether or not you're a child, whether you're a boarder, whether you're mother-in-law, whether you're the parents, there's a typo there too, sorry guys. Everybody who's listed in the 1850 census, their name is written out. It gives their name, it gives their birth date, it gives their place of birth. It doesn't necessarily tell you the relationship to the head of household. So it's not going to tell you whether they're the children, and it's not going to tell you whether or not they're just boarders. You don't start to see that information until you get closer to 1900. But what's important to know about censuses is that each census requests different information. So in 1880, they asked for occupation. In 1900, they asked for the month and the year you were born. In 1910, they ask you how many times you've been married. In 1920, they asked you if you owned a radio. In 1930, they asked you if you were a military veteran. So they ask different pieces of information each time a census is conducted, which can be really useful to a genealogist when they come in the door, because if in the 1900 census it gives their birth specifically as March 1886, but on all the other censuses it just rounded their age up to the nearest birthday, it could be really useful for tracking down a vital record then. Or if in 1930 it lists that they were a veteran, it would say a veteran of what war? So it would say World War I, or it would say Spanish-American War, or it would say Civil War. So there's some good information that can come out of that that'll lead you to additional resources. Here's just a representative sample. This is from the 1930 census. As you can see, when you look at it, it gives the head of the household first, and then any wives or children, if they had boarders, if they had sister-in-laws or mother-in-laws listed with them. The fourth one from the top has a mother-in-law listed, Julia Smith. It gives you where they're born. It gives you where their parents are born. A lot of times it's just a very loose generalization. As you see, Italy, Germany, Sweden, they're not giving you the exact towns or the exact provinces, but at least it's a start. It tells you what their native language is if it's not English. But what's important is it gives you the date that they arrived in the U.S. and whether or not they've naturalized. So in that column, about 3/4 of the way across to the right, it'll say NA for naturalized, it'll say AL for alien, it'll say PA if they have first papers. So that'll kind of help you figuring out exactly when somebody arrived in the U.S. And then the last category where you see a whole bunch of no's, that is whether or not they served in the U.S. Army or Navy at any point. And if they did, you'll see the war that they served. So in the middle, you see WW for World War. Sometimes you'll see, CIV listed for Civil War, SP for Spanish-American War. So each census provides some really good information. So when somebody walks up to you for the first time and they say, I hear you can help me research my family tree, censuses are going to be one of the main resources that you are going to point them to as you're going forward. Another important set of records are going to be vital records. So vital records are considered birth, marriages, and death records. They could be available at the city level, at the county level, or at the state level. Each state sets their own laws and regulations regarding their access to vital records, whether or not they can be placed online, whether or not there's a governor on the age at which the record needs to be in order for you to gain access to it. For example, in Illinois has a governor on records that birth records are available to the public after 75 years, marriages are available after 50 years, and deaths are available after 20 years. Now in Illinois, they are what's called an open records state, meaning you don't have to be next of kin to access these records. But a lot of the states in the South and along the Eastern Seaboard do require you to be next of kin in order to access records. Typically, they'll have you fill out a form. You'll make a copy of your driver's license, and then they'll provide you with a copy of the record. But keep in mind, too, that not all states were created at the same time. So some states' records are going to be older than other states. So in Illinois, deaths and births didn't begin being recorded until November of 1877. So even then, it was just requested. It wasn't required. So if you lived far from the county seat and you didn't want to have to trek through the snow in the winter to come down and record a birth or even record a death, you didn't have to. It wasn't mandatory until 1914. And even then, it was a catch me if you can. So my family's from Cook County. I'm born and raised in the city of Chicago. And my grandmother is one of 6 children. Only one of them actually has a birth record, a state-filed birth certificate, and that's in 1925. Even though they were all born after 1914, they didn't bother to go to the city or to the state to record their births. But every single one of them has a baptismal record. They just didn't bother to file with the county. So even though after 1914 it was mandatory, it was still a catch me if you can. So keep in mind that sometimes there just isn't going to be a record that exists for you for the time period that you're researching. When you start to get further west, you get out into Kansas and Nebraska, you're looking at birth records and death records not being recorded until 1910 and 1915. So, if you have somebody who's a pioneer in the 1840s, they're going to predate state-collected vital records registration. Now for Illinois State Archives claims that they have marriage records that go back to 1763. Don't think that that's everything. Those are just a handful of records. Statehood, Illinois State started in 1818. We've got the anniversary coming up in a couple of years. So the bulk of the records span from right about 1812 to the present. There are some very early records before that, but the bulk of them really begin just before statehood. So here's just a couple of examples. These are available online for free. The death certificate on the left-hand side is from the state of Missouri. Missouri Secretary of State's office has their death records online for free, accessible to the public up to 1965. So if you had family or ancestors who lived in Missouri, you have access to those for free. This one that I have on the right, this marriage certificate from Cook County, is a bit of a misnomer, and I apologize for that. You used to have access to the original images of the marriages and deaths from Cook County. Sadly, now we're left with just the indexes. The original images were taken out when Family Search renegotiated their contract. But you can find this information through FamilySearch.org, and you can find it through the Illinois State Archives through CyberDriveIllinois.org. So Jesse White is not only the Secretary of State, but he is the State Archivist and the State Librarian. And when you go to CyberDrive Illinois, you'll have different links for those offices. If you click on Illinois State Archives, the second link from the top will be databases, and if you click on that link, it'll take you to the marriage indexes. There are death indexes available. There are Civil War records indexes available. The state of Illinois has a law that birth records cannot be placed online, so you will not see an index to Illinois births. Other states have different laws. Wisconsin has their birth records accessible. It just depends on the individual state. The other thing that you're going to use a lot in your research are newspapers. So if you're lucky enough to have newspapers within your library, you might want to consider a volunteer project to have somebody index obituaries or marriage announcements or birth announcements if you have the ability to do that. If you're lucky enough that your city's newspapers have already been digitized and they're available online, then that's a huge advantage that you have over me in Will County. So there are a lot of websites that offer free access to digitized newspapers. The next couple of slides, I'm going to give you some examples, and you'll have them available to download within your handout. But a lot of online indexes have, again, every name searches. So you can go in and do a search for John Smith without having to know specifically when his date of death was or what date that he got married. You can just go in and do a search. There are some things to be advised when you're searching on online newspaper indexes. Cast a wide net, because the earlier the records are that you're seeking, the larger the population distance was. So now, for the city of Chicago, if I'm looking for an obit in the city of Chicago, I'm going to look in the Chicago Tribune or the Sun-Times. But sometimes those same obits in 1850 would get picked up in Milwaukee, or they'd get picked up in Rockford and in other places because there wasn't a large enough population. So you had to go further away in order to get that information out to a wider audience. So especially when you're dealing with, places like the Carolinas or Virginia, colonial periods, the city of Charleston was kind of the hub for all newspapers for both North and South Carolina. So if you had somebody who died in Greenville, it might still show up in the Charleston city newspapers 2, 4, 8 months later, because it took that long for the information to make it down to the largest newspaper within the state. So always catch a wider net. Don't limit yourself to just your town. If your town's newspapers aren't online, but there's a town nearby who does have an online index, search that one too, because they might have had friends or family who lived in that community. Don't limit yourself by search date, because if somebody dies in 1910, you might still find them listed in newspapers in 1915 and 1920. Maybe their spouse passes away after they do, or their kids mention them in their own obituaries. Or a lot of communities have way-back columns, 25 years ago, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, and they're going to be reprinting newspaper columns from 1910, 1930, 1955. So don't limit yourself by date, because you might still find your ancestor being listed long after their death. And the most important thing to keep in mind too is be flexible in your spellings. Not everybody spells things the way they should be spelled. So, Clark could be spelled with, an E or without. Smith can be spelled with an E, it could be spelled with a Y. My maiden name was Tatara, T-A-T-A-R-A, and it's spelled 8 different ways. So don't limit yourself to just how you're used to spelling a particular name, even with towns. Sometimes the person who's laying out the plates for the printer makes a mistake and misspells the town. I've seen Plainfield spelled P-L-A-N-E-F-I-E-L-D. So occasionally you have whole towns that are misspelled. So, be flexible in how you're spelling. Another thing that I didn't include here but is important to keep in mind too is sometimes it's better to just not search by first name and just search by surname, because especially with women, they're listed as, you know, Mrs. Joseph Smith, not Adelaide Smith. Or men are listed by their initials, you know, C.S. Marks versus, you know, Chester Marks. So sometimes you just want to search by surname and see what comes up. And I've got an example for you. So Ancestor Hunt is a free website that searches internationally. You could search by country. Chicago Tribune Newspaper Archives is free to the public. It's just the Chicago Tribune. It just brings up the article. It doesn't bring up the whole page, but it's a great resource to use for free. California Digital Newspaper Collection is statewide, and they have really good Orange County collection if you have anybody from Southern California. Chronicling America is done by the Library of Congress, and they really focus on mid-tier, mid-sized cities. So you'll find things like Milwaukee, Indianapolis, you know, those mid-sized cities, St. Paul, versus big cities like Los Angeles and Boston and Chicago. So it's a really good resource to use, and it's free. It's not always easy to search, but there's some good data in there. Elefind is another free newspaper index from around the globe. It's broken down by country and then by state as well. Elefind also includes in it Chronicling America. So I don't need to go to both places. I can just search one without having to do the same search twice. Family Search has a collection of newspaper obituaries. Fulton History is just New York research, so if any of you have somebody who's looking for New York ancestors, Fulton History has digitized over 20 million pages of New York newspapers from top to bottom, whether you're looking in Schenectady or the Finger Lakes or Brooklyn or Oswego. This guy has done an amazing job of making New York newspapers from the 1820s to the 1990s accessible. Google News Archive is really hard to search. You have to search by newspaper name. So you have to know that it's, you know, called the Wahoo Wasp. You know, you can't just search by state and then by city. It doesn't work that way. So if somebody comes to you and they're looking for newspapers from within their community, they'll have them listed as Aurora. Is it Aurora, Colorado, or is it Aurora, Illinois? They'll have things like Ottawa. Is it Ottawa, Illinois, or is it Ottawa, Canada? So sometimes you have to click on them and figure out exactly what city and county you're dealing with. They are not downloadable, and they are not searchable by name. It's just like looking at old microfilm. You just have to scroll through page by page by page by date to find what you're looking for. And because they're not printable, in order to get copies of these, a lot of times I have to do screenshots. So if anybody needs help with screenshots, send me an email and I'll explain how to do it. So here are some examples for you. It's not always about vital records. It's not all about births, and it's not all about deaths. You get a whole variety of things. This one on the right-hand side, you know, one of my favorite things is, you know, the gentleman who got beat up. You know, May 5th, Don Worrell slugged at Midway Airport. They made it into the newspaper. A lot of newspapers would run year-in-review columns. A lot of newspapers still do run year-in-review columns. So that alleviates the burden on you. If you can go in and search the first issue of the year, and it tells you every birth, every death, every major event, every marriage, then you don't have to scroll through page and page and page of newspapers trying to figure out when an event happened. So when you're in Google News Archive and you can't search by name, sometimes looking at the first issue of the year can provide you the data that you need. Some fun things out there: girl kills sweetheart who threatened dog. Hazel Blackadder, whose nickname was Bubbles, was angry with her boyfriend because he felt that she loved her dog more than she loved him. So he was going to eliminate the dog. And as he picked up the dog to walk out of the apartment with him, she shot him twice. And as you can see in the article, she says, "I'm sorry I shot him, but he had no business treating my dog that way." So the fun thing about this article is the fact that her boyfriend, who's not listed by name, oh it is, Milton Smith, 28 years old, was shot to death today by his sweetheart. The problem was Milton Smith was married, and his wife didn't live in Kansas City. She lived in Atchison. Kansas. So imagine you're sitting at the newspaper in Atchison reading the headlines, and you find out that your husband's been shot by his girlfriend. So a lot of times you can search newspaper accounts without having to have specific dates, just by searching by name. So there's some good things that you can find in there. So I also mentioned not searching by first name. You see Mr. and Mrs. Charles Clow are the proud parents of a fine baby girl. Daughter's name is never given. Any of these obits, a new, conductor, it tells me that his dad worked for the railroad. A new conductor made his appearance at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Irwin White. Right. No first name given. So when you're searching in newspaper indexes and when you're helping patrons searching in newspaper indexes, it really behooves you to not search under a specific name. You'll get a better search strategy. So now I've got a couple of case studies for you. Somebody comes up to the desk. These are questions that I've had, not just looking for wealthy relatives. I've had a patron come to the desk and say, I think I had an ancestor who served in the American Revolution. So throughout the process of my reference interview, I'm asking them, okay, what is your evidence? Why do you think that you have a revolutionary soldier? Well, family stories have always been that, great-great-grandpa had served, in the American Revolution under Nathaniel Greene. Okay. What other evidence do you have? Well, we have the family Bible, and the family Bible shows that he's born in 1750. Okay. If the family Bible showed that he was born in 1865 or 1765 or 1812, then you're probably not dealing with a case of an American Revolutionary War veteran. But 1750 would actually be in the correct time period. What resources had they used? Well, we've used Ancestry.com, and we found a couple of names listed in their online index. Okay, well, what are you hoping to accomplish? Well, we're hoping to become members of the Daughter of the American Revolution. I have children who are going to be going off to college, and we want to be able to apply for the DAR scholarships that they offer. Okay, let's get started and see what we can find. So luckily for Revolutionary War, there's a lot of resources that are available online. Half of them are available for free. They're not going to cost you anything. The other half are available through subscription. For those of you who have Heritage Quest already at your library, you already have access to the Revolutionary War pension files through your subscription to Heritage Quest. For those of you who might not have a subscription to Heritage Quest, fold3.com is a website that is designed by the National Archives to make available records from within the National Archives collections to the public. The National Archives has a military research room that sadly they've never been able to staff because of budget cuts. So they figured if they made records accessible online, then it would alleviate the need for people to come to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to use these records. Sadly, like I mentioned, just the opposite happened. So for those people who found out that they had these records, instead of just ordering them online, they wanted to come to the National Archives and see them in person. So they actually found that they're twice as busy now that they've started putting these collections online than they were when they were just available through indexes in the office. So a place to start would be Heritage Quest. Fold3 is another resource for you. And then the Daughters of the American Revolution has several research tools on their website. So if you ever go to the DAR website, they have what they call a Patriot Finder on their website, and then a Descendant Finder. So you can search for somebody in their lineage, even if you don't know who the patriot is. So if lore is that you had a patriot and it comes from mom's side of the family, you can search on mom's surname in the Descendant Finder to see who they connected to that was the actual patriot. So I started, the person was looking for Jeremiah Austin, and the story was that Jeremiah Austin had come to Illinois to live with his daughter Hannah and died shortly after arriving in the state of Illinois. So when I looked up Jeremiah Austin, I found in Heritage Quest there's only one record for Jeremiah Austin. It says that his application state was in Vermont and that his wife's name was Esther. Not quite sure, knew that his wife's name was Esther Colgrove, but the family lore was that he had served from Rhode Island, not from the state of Vermont. So when you hover over the Revolutionary War name in the index, it pops up a record box. Okay, says that her application was applied for in Illinois. We probably have the right person. So let's click on the record and see what comes out of it. So when I clicked on the record, it brought me to page 1 of Jeremiah Austin's Revolutionary War pension file, and in the upper left-hand corner it tells me that his service is in Rhode Island. So now that we know, we most likely have the correct person, and then we can start reading the records that have been digitized through Heritage Quest Online. So when you're in Heritage Quest, it's not very obvious necessarily how to get to the next page. You have to click on the arrow in the upper center of the screen in order to advance from one page to the next. So through the process of reading Jeremiah Austin's pension record, it does say that he served from the state of Rhode Island. It says that he served from 1777 to 1779. It says that he originally applied for his pension in the state of Vermont, which is why in the index it says Vermont, even though he served from Rhode Island. That's why it was a little confusing for the patron. So he and his wife moved to Illinois in 1846, where he died. She did not apply for pension in Illinois until 1853, which is actually kind of surprising, because usually widows don't have an income to sustain them once their husband's veteran's pension runs out. So throughout the course of reading the pension file, there is this letter that's included, and it's from 1975. And it gives me the address of the descendant who's investigating whether or not there's a pension record and a military service record for Jeremiah Austin. And in this record, the letter that the patron writes says, I'm looking for information on Jeremiah Austin and his father, whose name I do not know, who both supposedly served in the American Revolution, from Rhode Island. And this is a letter back from the National Archives that says, yes, we found Jeremiah Austin. We have not found any other record for an Austin that served from the state of Rhode Island. But it's a 3-page letter, and in this letter it spells out exactly what dates he served, the units in which he served, who the captains were of those particular units, and then when he was finally discharged. Now, the family lore was he served with Nathaniel Greene. You know, I can read in this pension file that it gives the name of Captain Maxon and it gives the name of Colonel Potter, but nowhere does it say that he served with Nathaniel Greene's regiment. But what it does tell me is that he received 2 wounds at the Battle of Quaker Hill, one from a musket ball and the other from a bayonet. So it tells me that he saw very close combat. So I wanted to follow up that a little further and figure out who else might have applied for a DAR application under his service name. So I went to the DAR website, and under the library tab, there's a link to get you to their online resource. And when I click on that and I do a search for the Patriot, I find that we have, you know, Private Jeremiah Austin, who served in Rhode Island, and it gives me his date of birth. What it also gives me is an exact date of death, and then it tells me a little bit more about his service record. But it tells me at the bottom that his daughter Hannah is the only person that has applied for a DAR membership within Jeremiah Austin's family tree. So what it tells me is, if you look where it's circled, it says treat as a new ancestor. The reason it says treat as a new ancestor is because nobody has applied since Hannah applied in the 1860s. So if a descendant is going to apply for access to the DAR under Jeremiah Austin's service record, they would have to create a whole new application and supply supporting documentation. Well, we have that available through Heritage Quest. We have his unit. We show that he's been wounded. It gives us his dates of service and his discharge. So then all you would have to do would be to prove your connection down the line from Jeremiah to yourself. So here's some great information. The DAR website is free and it's accessible to the public. If you wanted to purchase a copy of Hannah's application, they charge you $10 and you download it instantly to your computer. You don't have to wait for them to mail it to you. Fold 3 digitized these records also, as well as Heritage Quest. Heritage Quest did them about 20 years ago, so they did them in black and white. So while you look at the copy here, it's a little fuzzy, but it's readable. If you read these same application files in Fold 3, they scan them in grayscale, so the quality is better and the individual handwriting is better, and it makes them much easily, they're much easier on the eye, and they're easier to use through Fold 3. Now, Fold 3 is a subscription database, and if your library doesn't subscribe to it, I would recommend using it through Try It Illinois from now until November 30th. But they also offer free weekends and free months to certain collections. So in November, they'll have free weekends around Veterans Day. For Memorial Day, they'll have free weekends. So it's always something you can recommend to your patrons, that a couple times a year, if you sign up for their newsletter, their free blog, they'll send you announcements when they'll have their collections available for free. Second case study is, I've heard that my ancestor came through Ellis Island. Okay, so the first question is, what is their evidence? Well, family lore is that he came over, into Ellis Island. He was in New York for a couple of years before he came to Illinois. Okay, what resources have you used? Well, I've used Family Search, and I can find him in the census, but I can't find any ship's information on him. The question is, well, what do you wish to accomplish? Well, I want to find out when and where he arrived in the United States. I'd really like to find out what his home city is, his native city is, but I'd really just like to find out when he arrives in the U.S. So immigration records can be found in a lot of places. So they're available through Ancestry.com. They have indexes to all the U.S. ports from 1820 into the 1950s. You have access to the Immigrant Ships Transcribers Guild, which is also a free resource. That's immigrantShips.net. The Brigham Young University also has a free collection online that includes ships manifests. The vast majority of them are German. They're slowly starting to do other nationalities. German is where they started. You have Ellis Island. You have Castle Garden. There's a variety of places where you can go for that kind of data. So since they believed that they came from Ellis Island's website is where I started. So what I found when I went to Ellis Island was Joseph Tatara, who's my great-grandfather, came through Ellis Island on February 20th, 1907. I was able to find his ship's manifest online through their website, so I went to libertyellisfoundation.org. You sign up for a free account, you create a username and password, and then you have access to their ship's manifest and images of the individual ships as well. So I know that he eventually came to Chicago. I know that he applied for his naturalization, not once, but twice. I know that I could look at the online index for Cook County naturalizations. There's the link for you for any of you who have Northern Illinois ancestors who might have naturalized. So once I found the indexes online, I was able to go to the county clerk's office, the circuit clerk's office in Chicago, and look at the original naturalization papers. So I started with the censuses. This one is 1920. So on the 1920 census, it tells me that he has his first papers. It says PA, and it gives me the year that he applied for his papers. It tells me the year that he arrived and then the year that he applied. What's interesting is that underneath it, they had started to say that his wife, Sophia, also naturalized, and then they crossed it out because women didn't typically naturalize. Depending on the time period that you're looking for immigration records, a lot of times it's just the man who naturalizes and the wife does not. So they actually started to write it in and then crossed it out. So I know that I can look at this record and say, okay, somewhere there's going to be a naturalization record. I know he arrived in the U.S. and it gives me the year. It tells me that at the time of his application, they're living on West Huron, which is on the left-hand side of the screen. So then I went into the Ellis Island database. I signed up for my free account, and I see that there are 4 different Joseph Tataras listed as coming to the U.S. through Ellis Island. Well, by looking at the census data, it gives me the date that he arrived in the U.S. So that helped me narrow down which Joseph Tatara was my Joseph Tatara by using the date that was on the 1920 census. So it says that he's from Vitavis. It tells me the name of the ship that he's on. And if I clicked under Actions on the little person with the lines, then it takes me to the actual ship's manifest. Now, when you're looking at Ellis Island ship's manifest, there are 2 pages. Even if you're looking on Ancestry, even if you're looking through Brigham Young, there's 2 pages to the ship's manifest. So you want to make sure that you're going forward a page and backwards a page to make sure that you're not missing important data. So what I find is that Joseph Tatara is listed here all by himself. He's 24 years old. It gives me the name of the city which he had left in Austria. Tells me, that he's coming to stay with his family, and it tells me that he's specifically coming to Chicago, Illinois. When you're looking at ships manifests, don't assume that if they said they came from Germany, or they said they came from Poland, or they said they came from Ireland, that that's what it's going to say on the ship's manifest. At the time that Joseph arrived in the U.S., Poland didn't exist. So his records aren't going to say Poland, they're going to say Austria-Hungary, because Poland didn't exist until 1917. So when I look at his naturalization papers, he says Poland because that's the country when he applies for his citizenship, but that country didn't exist at the time that he arrived in the U.S. So when I go to Cook County to try to look for those first papers, I see two different applications for Joseph Satara. The first one, it says that he's born March 19, 1880, and gives the name of the city. The second one says he's born March 19, 1881, and gives the name of the city. Misspellings and errors in town names are very, very common. You know, misremembering your own birth date? Not so sure about that. But I know it's the same person once I look at the actual original applications. So don't exclude somebody because it says they're from Austria or it says they're from Hungary instead of Poland, because at the time that they're emigrating, you have to be sure what the city is, what the country is that they're leaving. So on the census, it says that he's living on West Huron. When I look at this application, you know, that he applied, his declaration date is 1920, he's living on West Huron. So I know I have the right person in my application because the date on the census, or the address on the census, matches the address on the naturalization record. So then I was able to go to Cook County and pull this record and get the information on the town that he came from in Poland. There's a website that I don't have a screenshot for here, but it's in, I'll have it for next week, and it's in the handouts from February. The Jewish Genealogy organization, jewishgen.org, has a database on their website that's called Town Finder. And what's brilliant about this collection is that it takes a town in Eastern or Central Europe, and it shows you every spelling, and it shows you every country that that town was associated with. So if you had a town that was Austria-Hungary and then became Poland, or it was on the border between France and Germany, or it was on the border between Germany and Russia, it's going to show you with geo-coordinates all of the different ways that that city name is spelled. So then you can take that information and compare it to what's written on the ship's manifest, what's written on the naturalization record, what might be written in the family obit that they put in the local newspaper, and it'll help you understand with different languages exactly what all of those different towns are actually the same place. There are several books that I highly recommend you have in your library. If you don't already have them, they're kind of the gold standard when it comes to genealogy reference books. Elizabeth Bentley has put out several. These books might seem a little dated, and they might seem like, well, we don't want to add books to our collection that are from 1992. There aren't reprints of these. A lot of these are so good on their own merit that they haven't put out updated information, updated editions, because the information hasn't changed. But I would recommend something like Ancestry's Red Book, County Courthouse Book. On the next slide, you have Lou Zook's book, The Source, which is the Guidebook of American Genealogy. It's put out by Ancestry Publishing. These are all outstanding resources to have available to you. So when somebody comes up to the desk and asks you a question and you're not quite sure how to find it online, you can flip through one of these resources, or you can give it to your patron and say, if you're looking for the county courthouse in Armentrout, West Virginia, it's going to provide them with the address, the content of what they have at the courthouse, and the phone number to contact them. So they're really outstanding resources. Jack Simpson, who was a good friend of mine who used to work for the Newberry Library, put out a genealogy reference book. It's called The Basics of Genealogy Reference. It's a librarian's guide. It came out in 2008, but the information in it is still very reliable. Jack took the time to put together a resource guide for librarians that talks about how to use census information, how to use vital records information, how to use cemetery information, and put it together in a very easily readable book. So if you have the opportunity or you have a professional reference collection for your staff, this is one that I would highly recommend having as well. And then the last one that I think every library should have is Elizabeth Shown Mill's book, Evidence Explained. There's a brand new edition that just came out at the end of last year. And basically what it is it teaches genealogists, it teaches researchers and librarians like us how to correctly cite historical sources. So whether you are citing a database from a website, whether you are citing a vital record from the courthouse, whether you are citing photographs from your Grandma Nellie's scrapbook, she explains exactly how to properly source and cite the genealogy research that patrons are doing. This is imperative. This is something you should hand every genealogist before they walk out of your office after their reference interview, because all too often you will see genealogists who will not adequately cite their sources. They'll get all the way home and realize, oh, I forgot where I got that. And they can't go back and recreate the wheel. So Elizabeth Shown Mill's book is absolutely the best resource that you can have in your collection to help them properly cite and source the resources that they're using from within your genealogy collections. So I am finished. This gives us a little bit of time for questions, if anybody has some questions for us.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Gina. That was a lot of information to cover in such a short time. I did have a question come up during while you were talking, and we have a question is why, going back to the vital records, can you talk a little bit more about why current records are not available online? Is it because they haven't been digitized, or is it because of privacy issues?
It depends on the state, because some states will say, no, it's a violation of privacy. To give you an example, Oklahoma passed a law last year that says death records are only accessible to the deceased for 75 years. That's physically impossible. If you're the deceased, how can you possibly request your vital records? And the state legislature took it to the floor. They brought it to their attention. The Oklahoma State Genealogical Society said this is physically impossible. A dead person cannot request their records. And the Oklahoma legislature let it stand. And then you have other states like Virginia, who has taken a lot of flack because they've made all of their vital records available online up to 2004. And there's a lot of people who are crying that that's a violation of privacy. You have people who claim that it's a violation of HIPAA, which is crazy because HIPAA only applies to the living. It doesn't apply to you once you die. You have government agencies who are saying that it's just going to increase the chance of identity theft. There's only been one documented case of identity theft coming from somebody stealing Social Security numbers through the Social Security Death Index. And it actually turned out that it was a woman who had worked for the gentleman as a nurse and a housekeeper. So she didn't steal the information from the SSDI. She already had access to it through his bills and his personal effects. But in all of these years of this information being accessible to the public, they can only come up with one documented case. But one documented case was all that was needed for the federal government to shut it down. So now we only have access to the Social Security Death Index online up to 2014, and in some cases not even, because I sent a pointed email to Genealogy Bank yesterday because my grandmother no longer shows up in the SSDI, even though she was there 6 months ago. So databases change, information goes missing, companies decide on their own what records they want to make accessible. States have the right to decide, they have the right to pass laws to say what they're going to make available. Like I said, in the state of Illinois, birth records are not allowed to be put online because that's the state law. In the state of Wisconsin, it's different. Wisconsin has births online and they have marriages online, but they don't have deaths online. So it really comes down to the state's willingness to work with genealogical societies and historians, and whether or not they're willing to take the time to understand how genealogists and how historians are using vital records and using that kind of data. but a lot of it's fear-mongering. A lot of it is the state just decides that this is the threat without investigating why or how it's being used, and they shut it down, which is a detriment to genealogists everywhere.
Great.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Well, as we wait for other questions to come in, do you want to talk at all about the handouts you provided?
Yeah, one of the handouts that I gave you that's in the handouts on the link through the webinar, it's just a finding aid that I created for my library. It's for early resources available at the Plainfield Library. It's in there instead of email just because of the size, because of the graphics that were included in it. The other resources that I gave you a cheat sheet for quick genealogy reference points. So if somebody's looking for cemeteries or if somebody's looking for vital records or church records, it's just a very quick handout on where you can go for that type of information. I use a genealogy correspondence log that I keep track of at my library. So when somebody comes in and asks me a genealogy question, I record it on this log with the patron's name, their contact information, and what they were searching, as well as what I found. And believe it or not, I go back to those sheets regularly because I'll have people who are looking for the same family or they're looking for the same business, and then I can email that person and say, would you mind if I shared your information with this new researcher, or can I give you their email address and the two of you can connect? So I created this log so that I could keep track of not only the number of questions that I'm receiving, but it allows me to not reinvent the wheel every time somebody's looking for Alonzo Hemstreet. I can just pull up that data that I created for the previous request and make it available. There are two different research logs in there for you. Like I said, the number one thing you can do for your patrons is teach them how to cite their sources. So what the research log allows you to do is put what the item is, the call number, the ISBN, the number of the edition that the book happens to be, where they found it. They found it in the reference department at this particular library, and then the date that they accessed it. Because editions change, books get weeded from a collection, items get moved, so having a research log allows them to find that item again if it has changed locations or if a new edition has come out. You have a family group sheet in there. That is for people who are doing research. It allows them to put an entire family on one sheet. So it would have the mother and the father listed on it, as well as all of their children. I think it goes up to 7 children that you can include. And the reason why family group sheets are so important is because it's a quick reference to allow you to see where your holes are in your research. So if you know there are 5 children, but you only have data on 2 or 3 of them, it allows you to then add directly to the log as you're working. So there are just a variety of different tools and research sheets that I use in order to help my patrons stay focused on what they're looking for that day.
Terrific. Well, we didn't get any other questions, so I guess we'll wrap up a little bit early. So thank you again, Tina, for being here today and sharing your expertise with us. And we really appreciate Tina also giving us permission to record today. So I will process recording and post it on the Rails CE Archives page within the next day or two. And so thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and thanks again to Tina.
Thank you, Louise. Hopefully I will see some of you again on October 11th.
That's right.
Please feel free to go in and share the handouts with anybody in your library or anybody in your world that you think might find them useful. And again, there's the handouts and the broadcast from February that's accessible to you as well.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.